It's Sue Stockdale and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast, the show where you can gain inspiration from people who may be unlike you. We hope their stories and insights enable you to transcend your day-to-day challenges and reflect on what you are capable of achieving. I hope you're enjoying this series on the theme of 21st century changemakers. When I was discussing it with Clive Steeper, the other co-founder of this podcast, we were thinking about what aspects we should explore. He suggested happiness and well-being, as it's been a subject on all of our minds during the pandemic. That's what led us to today's guest, Nic Marks, who is founder and CEO of Friday Pulse. Described by one client as a statistician with a soul, Nic has been working in the field of happiness and well-being for over 25 years. Welcome to the podcast, Nic. Great to have you here.
Lovely to be here, Sue. Thank you for asking me.
Well, there's so much we could talk about, and thinking about measurement and statistics and happiness, so many ways we could take this conversation. So maybe I want to just kick off and say, if I was to ask you, what generally makes you happy, Nic? What springs to mind?
Oh, I think I'm very typical in that relationships are the biggest key to happiness. You know, the times in my life where I've been unhappy have been because relationships have broken down. Or you've been lonely, or at school when you didn't fit in. And we're very relational as beings, and our happiness is very driven by our sort of social connectedness and relationships and the quality of them.
There's a kind of a real emotional element to what you're saying there. It sounds to me like a mix of things you're bringing to what you do in your work.
Yes, I guess that's what makes me a slightly unusual statistician. I trained as a therapist when I was young too, so I am quite emotional. My mother was a family therapist. And I love the whole emotional realm. It's how we feel alive. So it probably is no accident I end up being the guy that measures happiness because, you know, I've got that sort of hard statistical skill and the sort of softer people ones. Yeah.
So that's, to me, a really interesting and important combination in terms of having that balance of those two things. And yet in our planet and society, it seems like, and I'm sure you'll be able to tell me from your research as well, that very often we're skewed in terms of what we're measuring.
Yes, we tend to measure what's easy to count, not what's most important. I mean, sometimes things are easy to count and important, but they're not necessarily. And so I've become interested in how you create measures of people's experience of life. And I kind of use that quite carefully. I don't think we ever capture precisely to 3 decimal places what's going on. But we can create numbers which are indicators and that they help us make decisions better. And so you have to get used to a different type of data. And of course, some statisticians, data people don't like some of the ambiguity when you measure things, what we call subjective measures. You're asking people their perception of either their own life or other things. And, you know, we have problems with polling data. Do people tell the truth and things like that? And these are issues at the margins. But it's a new type of data, subjective data, and it tells different information. And it's very, very useful. And that's what I've spent the last 15, 20 years of my career thinking about, how you create useful measures that actually help create positive change in the world.
And how has that then been received by those organisations, governments, countries that you've worked with?
It's much more receptive these days. When I started off as a more hardcore statistician with my stats. I was measuring long-term effects of climate change in 1994. So sort of quite ahead of the game with things like that. Though, of course, there were lots of economists and people doing work like that at that time, but it's what interests me as a young man. And then as I started to get more into well-being and happiness, I worked at a think tank in London. Its reason for being was around social justice and sustainability. And I was the guy in the corner with slightly long hair saying, we should talk about happiness, guys. And they were a little, not dismissive, but, you know, they sort of gave me a desk. And then when the work that I started to lead and started to build a team became really successful, obviously everyone took notice. And that came from about 2004 onwards. So it moved in that 10 years from people really not wanting to talk about these things to people starting to open it up. And I was then working in government policy, and the Cameron government, and then, firstly the Tony Blair government, then the Cameron government were really quite very interested in this space. And we started to do a lot of quite influential work through the, whatever we call that decade, the noughties or whatever people call it, but the 2000s. I guess that took us all by surprise. I was doing work I believed in. I didn't particularly expect it to be widely taken up and successful.
And in terms of the impact that, because you say it's been successful, what have been some of the impacts then that are measured, if you like?
Well, so when I was in the policy world, so I now work on work, and we can talk about that later, but the policy work I did in the 2000s, we started out with an aim that we might get the Scottish government or the Welsh Assembly to create a measure of well-being in the next 10 years. And then David Cameron launched the Office of National Statistics Accounts of Wellbeing in 2011, 2012. And so that sort of success that actually governments were going to invest in this type of measurement and to promote it was a real thing. I mean, we were one of 2 or 3 groups that were campaigning on this area. I mean, there's quite a lot of academic work on this area, but in the sort of think tank world, we were really the only one that were really promoting this hard at that time. It was really gratifying to have a decade of your work where you had clear outcomes. Obviously, my TED Talk, which came in 2010, was a personal marker, but in the end, TED Talks don't actually change very much. But the fact that government starts measuring it, and now the government has data, and the Office of National Statistics had a whole system set up that, when COVID struck, they could move from monthly measurement to weekly measurement and things like that. They had their ways of doing it so they could respond to what they needed to do. I'm not saying it necessarily affects policy at its core, but at the margins, it's starting to have an effect. And something like this will take decades to start to feel. And of course, it may be a project that gets abandoned. We've been very dominated politically by Brexit and other things over the last decade. So there's been less space for it, but I would imagine it will come back because it's sensible. It's people's experience of life. And I think that's what policy should be about, improving people's lives.
And I know that you've also worked in developing the Happy Planet Index. Tell me about that. What does that involve?
So the Happy Planet Index was a very campaigny part of my work when I was at the organisation New Economics Foundation. I was challenged to come up with an indicator for sustainable development that included well-being. And basically, the idea of it was to say that the purpose of nations is to create good lives for their citizens that don't cost the earth, which is a really reasonable request. and you can measure it. And so the Happy Planet Index first came out in 2006. And again, I was expecting a few UK media to pick it up, but actually within 2 weeks, we had 180 different countries around the world published the Happy Planet Index in their newspapers. And it really got things buzzing. The reason was I think it put happiness in a great context, which was saying that in some ways, there is something called the World Happiness Report that now comes out, and it always shows Scandinavia wins, which is, yes, interesting, but not unexpected, but not, whereas a Happy Planet Index says, let's look at Costa Rica, let's look at Vietnam, let's look at countries that are using much less resources to achieve 90% of the well-being of the West, or even more. Costa Rica actually has got absolutely level with the West on well-being measures. So it's really saying if we want to create a future which is good for citizens in the future, then we have to look at how we create that. And we will be doing a new Happy Planet Index later this year, which we're going to use the data from the pandemic year, which will be a little challenging because the data is only really, some of the data like on carbon footprint and things will be ahead of release, but we'll make very good estimates of it and how we can do it. And the Happy Planet Index captured imagination, really. And so it was really to sort of change hearts and minds. It's not an indicator you can make policy on in that detailed level because it's very high level, but it's one that can change the debate. And we see it taught in A-level economics now. University economics courses will start showing the little video of me on TED about it. I sometimes get texted by one of my nieces or nephews going, "Uncle Nick, you just been in my economics lecture," which is very funny.
Well, you can see that you're measuring the impact of your effectiveness then, if you can reach your family members by their learning as well.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me think, and I did hear you have this conversation in another interview you did, was about how every day we get the information about the FTSE 100 index or the exchange rate in the newspapers and in the media. How do you think that a measure around happiness and well-being could also be incorporated in something like that?
The issue with it is, so yes, we could measure things. And in fact, YouGov in the UK, they measure the mood of the nation weekly and they release that data. The issue is normally, in normal times, it's relatively stable. Things like the weather affect our daily mood. So when it sunshines like it is today, it's a glorious sunny day today, everyone feels lifted. And particularly in the UK, where we have quite variable weather. Two of my team are in India and it's sunny every day and it's relentless. So I don't think so. It's about the variability, isn't it? But it's quite stable in the population level. Of course, COVID has been exceptionally interested with it because the pandemic has absolutely impacted everybody's daily, weekly experience. And the data absolutely reflects that. It's a huge crash in population and indeed employee well-being in March. There was some recovery last summer. There was another huge dip in most of the population in the autumn. Little peak at Christmas, huge dip again. We're still way below pre-pandemic levels of happiness in the population. And only a weekly measure can start to show those changes. Hopefully, we won't have another global pandemic like that. And so the more interesting thing from a policy perspective is in government policy is the longer term trends. In businesses, that's very different. Actually, weekly mood is massively important because it's very linked to productivity, creativity, innovation, those sort of things. And for us, it's important. But across the whole population. Each of us have our own ups and downs. Your football team wins if you're a football fan, and that will probably put you up. If they lose, they go down. If you get married, you're hopefully going to have a happier life, at least for a while. And so these personal things, but at a population level, they tend to balance out.
So you've introduced this idea, and we can take our conversation towards the organisational level rather than the country or governmental level, and thinking about happiness and well-being. And I know you have created an indicator around how organisations can be measuring that. Tell me about that.
The idea really of what we do, I have a company called Friday Pulse, and what we do is we measure the weekly experience of employees, because that's so close to the business issues, which are, do people feel confident in their work? Are they learning things? Are they creative? Are they engaged, effectively? I mean, I would say happiness is a better measure of engagement than most engagement measures, because it's people's felt experience. And when we feel good, we do good work. But it's very close to our mood. And so measuring it weekly is great for businesses. Basically, what we do is we create effectively a data feedback loop for people, which is that we ask everyone on a Friday, that's why we call Friday Pulse, how was your week? And you're looking back in your week, how was it? How did you feel? And then on Monday, we feed all that results back to team leaders, or to teams, actually, the whole team, to division heads or organizers, and they can see what the mood of all the teams are. And COVID was a huge setback for everybody at the same time. But every team, every organization has its own personal setbacks, whether it's the stress of a product launch, or it's a merger, or it's a clients, or it's this, it's whatever. There's things going on all the time. And so sometimes I think of like happiness having different wavelengths. There's very long-term ones, over years and decades, and we have good periods of our life and less so. And then there's very, very rapid ones, 5 moods in the morning. People do try and measure things right through the day, but that's very burdensome. You can't be expecting people to answer all the time, but to answer once a week is a good compromise.
So with that measure, I'm imagining it a bit like the old days of a graphic equalizer, where you have different dials that you're switching to adjust to get the best sound quality for your piece of music. What are the dials? What are the 5 things, if there are 5 things, that are being measured in an organization that then can influence that happiness indicator?
You teed that up very nicely for me. We do talk about there being 5 ways for happiness at work. And these are basically the big sort of drivers of people's good experience at work. And they are connect, which is relationships, as I said, are most key, really. Be fair, that if we don't feel we're treated fairly, we don't really get into a happiness space. Provokes anger when we feel treated unfairly. Empower, which is about being ourselves, making our own decisions, using our strengths. Challenge is actually challenge and stretch is really good for our well-being and happiness at work. Boredom's a total killer, actually. Boredom is much worse than stress. It's not to say stress is good. It's not good. It's too much stress. But boredom is much more corrosive than stress. And then the final is to feel inspired, which is that we like what we're doing. We feel we're achieving goals. We feel we're attached to something bigger than ourselves. It's a great change process. So those are the 5 things: connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire, that we talk about as the big drivers.
Hi, it's me again. I hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you are, please don't keep your thoughts to yourself, but take a minute to review this podcast series for us. You can now do so easily by going over to the accesstoinspiration.org website, and right there on the homepage you will find a link to click on. We'd really appreciate you taking a moment to do that. Now back to Nic. You're also making me think about the word fear, which isn't in one of those 5 measures. How do you see that fear plays in to measuring happiness at work?
Fear can be thought of as an emotional experience, and what psychologists will tend to call one of the key negative emotions. And they don't mean negative by being dysfunctional. They mean negative as it's responding to a threat. And fear motivates us in the sense that it makes us want to avoid whatever the outcome is. So there is a way that management by fear works to an extent, in that it gets people to want to avoid the negative consequences of not doing what they are. If it's internal fear of your boss, it's a really negative way of motivating people. If it's fear of something happening in the market, something happening outside you need to respond to, that's a sort of positive, constructive use of fear in a way. And there's evidence to show that what tends to happen with fear is, yes, we do get some energy, but it's very, very particular to dealing with the fear. Whereas when we've got the energy from enthusiasm or interest or curiosity, we're much more expansive in how we do it. So we're much more creative in possibilities. So Creativity, if you set people creative tasks, you motivate some people by fear and some people by enthusiasm, joy, inspiration. Then the people who are positively motivated solve the problem 4 or 5 times as often or 4 or 5 times as quickly. So it's massively important for creativity. And it's just much nicer to everybody than to do it that way. But it would be wrong to say that fear doesn't work to an extent. It does. But it's much more positive and constructive. I would say about 3 times more in terms of productivity benefits, creativity benefits, loyalty benefits. I mean, if you make people frightened, they're going to leave. So you haven't got a stability of team there. So there's not much positive to say about managing by fear, but it would be wrong to say that it doesn't work at all.
As you're talking there, Nic, I'm just thinking about, because I'm not a proponent of fear as being a way to motivate people at all, I should say. And yet I'm seeing about the introduction of this way of measuring in organizations. I'm thinking, why don't organizations snap your hand off and take your organization up on introducing this? And is sometimes the reticence to using happiness as a measure and well-being, is there some fear around, does that put a greater responsibility on me as a leader to behave differently? Who's responsible for generating the happiness is maybe where my question is heading.
I think we definitely do find that some organizations worry about opening a Pandora's box of emotions. And the thing is, they're there already. If they're not in the light, they're festering, they're causing problems. So occasionally we've had organizations where they unveil something that they needed to deal with that they've been avoiding. And we see that certainly with teams. There's always microcultures around teams. And actually our data will show which teams look more functional than not. And what we try and do is work with the team leaders to improve it. We're not trying to shame team leaders. We're basically trying to help them have better conversations with their teams. And in our product, we go to quite a lot of effort to include team leaders in it, because if they enjoy using our product, everything works. And so we try and help them be a better team leader is sort of the ethos of it. Yeah, we see some organizations that think, oh, God, if I talk to them about happiness, they're going to want more benefits, more this, more that. Actually, what people want is better relations, more key goals, feel that they're on a boat together and they're making the boat go fast. I mean, a happy ship goes better. In some ways, the alignment is absolutely there. It need a sort of enlightened leader to boldly go for it. But what we find is that most senior leaders, after a while, they really get it. Often the senior leaders themselves are really reluctant to engage with Friday Pulse on their own thing. And I think it's because actually they know in their heart of hearts that they're quite stressed. And so they're sort of a bit worried about exposing their vulnerability. That's a journey for them, and it can work without them expressing their vulnerability. It tends to work better if senior leaders actually do engage with it. Yeah, it is a difficult thing because we haven't really in Britain been good at expressing our emotions and talking about them. So we're getting a lot better.
And do you find then there's a better take up from other countries other than the UK?
No, I think it's a business tool in lots of ways. I mean, we can go into the sort of like, oh, it's great to build a whole happier world of work. And I'm totally in that mission. But it's sensible business. It's good business as well as good practice. So there's a real alignment. In fact, we just released data, I don't know if you saw it last week, on COVID and how it impacted everyone's happiness. And I said about it earlier, how it went down and then up and then down again. Our clients had the first dip, not as deep as the UK population. They haven't had a second or third dip with the people's experience at work. Doesn't mean to say that people outside of work haven't got problems, but at work, they've managed to keep the conversations going and keep a remarkable stability. In a sense, when we talk about resilience as the ability to bounce back from a shock, but also the ability to absorb a shock. And the first COVID shock, everybody felt, caught us all by surprise. But the second wave was not a surprise. And our clients who are already putting wellbeing front and center, that's why they're using us. We're not the only thing they do, but our clients have been absolutely resilient in it. I mean, they're still lower than last year, of course, but 5% lower, whereas the UK population looks like it's 20-25% lower in any wellbeing measure that's that way. So it's a big difference.
And if any of our listeners are not employed in an organization that's using that kind of measure to evaluate happiness and well-being, what can an individual do? So, I just relate to our podcast being access to inspiration, Inspire being one of the things that you're measuring. What can any individual do to evaluate their own level of happiness on a regular basis? And perhaps the role that this podcast is playing in their inspiration.
We created a measure called Friday One, which is just a free tool for individuals to check up on their own happiness at work. And it's basically 15 questions which get into those drivers of happiness at work: connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire. And it gives you a nicely designed report with your data back. It benchmarks you against the UK or wherever you are, against people you are similar age and things like that, and shows you. But it's mainly a reflection tool. It's to say, this is, if you answer honestly, it'll give you an honest answer back again. And it's a bit like one of those 16 personalities sort of questionnaires like Myers-Briggs, except it's more action orientated. It's more saying, these are the things you can do. And in a way, it's kind of inspired from my therapy days, in that a good therapist, really what they do is they listen to you and they reflect back to you how you're feeling. And then maybe they ask you some questions to help you make better decisions. So the tool Friday One is designed the same way. It listens by asking you questions. It reflects back by sending you a report. And in the report are questions for you to reflect on. And for me, coming into awareness is the start of change processes. And whether that's individual, team-based, organizational, global, it's about becoming aware is the first steps towards creating things. And so I try and create statistical tools that increase awareness around what's going on in order to help people make better decisions.
So there's something for the individual here that can help them as well as somebody working in an organization.
Yeah, they can just go to friday1.com and it's just a free test, takes 5 minutes, and it's fun and useful.
So how do you keep challenging you then, Nic? What are the numbers that are in your mind that are coming to your awareness?
Obviously, me and my team, we measure our experience weekly, and it allows you to chalk on there, like, what are successes for you, who you want to thank, because we try and create basically positivity resonance, we call it, within teams. I do measure my happiness every week. And I'm someone that's deeply reflective. I'm a kind of slow moving bear. I'm not a fast creature. I walk. I don't meditate. My walk is my sort of meditation, but I'm quite reflective and slow. If I get too busy, I get a bit stressed. And sometimes during COVID, absolutely, I've got stressed and just had to take an emergency day off or allow myself not to get to work until 10 instead of 8:30 or something. That self-care is pretty good in me. But, like everybody, sometimes I'd like to create more free tools for individual, but I kind of just have to get my business going a bit before I can. I've always got 1,000 ideas, which is not even my number two. I work for Liz, really. But Liz, says to me, right, no new ideas, Nic. No new ideas. We're just doing the ones we've had already. Okay, no new ideas. And so they keep coming, but I have to put them aside.
So just like when somebody might be measuring their weight, if they want to lose weight or get fitter, they set themselves a goal in the longer term. Using your measure, what's the goal that you want to see in terms of how the world might be different or how organizations might be different in the longer term?
There is something fundamentally different. Like if you wear a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or whatever and you count your steps, it actually gives you new information about yourself, because actually we don't know how many steps you walk. And I do find apps like that really useful, because I'm not the fittest person because I don't like sweaty exercise, but I do walk. So that's good. The issue we do is we ask you how happy you are. So when we reflect back to you, it's not exactly new information because you've just told me. So something like Friday One becomes more interesting because it gets into the drivers and it's signposting to you how you can reflect and do on that. Having said that, I think that measuring weekly does show you the ebbs and flows of our experience, and we all have it. I was in a pickle personally. It's about 8 years ago. I just got divorced and I didn't really quite know where I was going. And I went to this therapist and she said to me, Nic, can you write out a word about every year of your life? So you start when you're 0 and then you go through every year of your life, right? And I thought, God, this is going to be a really profound, it is a profound intervention, but it wasn't what I expected. And I came back expecting to have to go through the whole life story, which is a really useful process when you're in counseling or therapy. And she said, what do you really notice about it? And I said, well, there were good years and there were bad years. And she said, yeah, you're in a bad time at the moment. But look, you've always come out of them before. And so understanding that I've had bad times before and I've found my way out of it made me understand that I was going to find my way out of it. And that, yes, it's a period for reflection, for licking wounds, for all that sort of stuff that you do when that sort of thing happens in your life. And it's also a time for rebuilding. And so it was really helpful. And I think in that way, understanding that it's normal to not be happy all the time. It's also normal to want to be happy. That's a perfectly valid thing. I used to say, because I had a relationship go wrong and it wasn't the first one I had go wrong. I was going, oh my God, I'm terrible at relationships. And how could I choose again? I felt like I'd really lost my confidence in how I was choosing a partner. And I needed to reflect and then make better choices in the future.
And did you make a better choice in the future? That's what I want to know. How did the story end?
I've been very happily married to Zoe for about 4 years now. And it's most certainly the best relationship of my life. And it's the most honest. It's like, I think by the time you get to my age in the 50s, You can't be anybody else but yourself. You can't pretend to be anybody else but yourself. And so to be in a relationship where you feel that there's no pressure to be anyone other than yourself is great. And in fact, to take that back to work, it's one of our key indicators at work. Can you be yourself at work? If people kind of have to put on armor to go to work, there's something we call emotional labor. So people who work in very frontline work have to smile all day and be happy when they're not. That's really hard work. I'm not saying you should be miserable and bad to customers, but it's like you sort of need your way of being yourself at work. So I think that not pretending to be something else, it's just be yourself at work is the best option. I think that's the same in a relationship.
So I think that the very useful insight for our listener to make sure that they can be themselves. If people want to find out more about you, Nic, and the work that you do, how might they do that?
Friday1.com is the personal checkup about happiness at work. It's fun, easy to use, 5 minutes, you get something. Friday Pulse is for organizations. There's demo videos and things like that you can look at or book a demo if you've got a team organization that's interested. Happy Planet Index is just happyplanetindex.org. It's 2014 data or something at the moment, but come back in November and there'll be a new one of those. I have a personal website, nicmarks.org, and I'm most active on LinkedIn. I post at least every fortnight an article on there and stuff like that. So just send me a contact request or follow me.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure the listener to this podcast will be able to get the sense of your happiness through the sound of your voice, Nic. I can see you smiling, and it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I immediately went on to friday1.com to measure my own happiness, so you might want to try that too. In the next episode, I will be speaking to Tanmay Vora, whose ideas and thinking on leadership, learning and change are conveyed in the amazing sketch notes that he creates. I do hope you will join me then.